What if, for the first time in modern history, an entire generation worked harder and got poorer? They studied more, took on more debt, and entered the job market in one of the most advanced economies in the world, and yet they can't afford rent, can't pay back loans, and can't plan for the future. This is the story of Gen Z, the poorest generation in modern America. They didn't choose this start. Gen Z, born between the mid-1990s and early 2010s, came into a world already cracked by inequality. By the time they took their first steps, wealth gaps in the US were widening faster than ever. In fact, the income of the top 1% was growing 5 times faster than the bottom 90%. And for many Gen Z kids, poverty wasn't a temporary phase, it was the starting point. In 2005, as the generation was just beginning, households below the poverty line had double the birth rate of those with higher incomes. More children were being born into families that had less money, less education, less access. This meant millions of Gen Zers were starting life, with odds already stacked against them. And in a country like the US, where public safety nets are weaker than in most developed nations, being born into poverty isn't just unfortunate, it's predictive. It often means lower quality schools, fewer opportunities, and a much harder path to college, even basics. Financial support from parents, like staying at home rent-free or covering emergencies, isn't an option. So while the average net worth for Americans under 35 is often cited as over $70,000, for most Gen Z adults, the real number is closer to $14,000, if they're lucky. Because averages lie, they're pulled up by a tiny percentage of wealthy outliers, while most young people are drowning in debt or stuck at zero.
And if you value stories that reveal what's really happening to today's generation, hit like and subscribe. It helps us grow and keeps us telling the stories that matter.
For most of Gen Z, the numbers just don't add up. They're earning more degrees than previous generations, working multiple jobs, and still can't afford to live on their own. Why? Because the cost of simply existing has skyrocketed, while wages have barely moved. Let's start with housing. In 1975, a typical house in the US cost around $4,200 or about $244,000 in today's money. In 2024, that same house, over $512,000, more than double even after adjusting for inflation. And in major metro areas, where jobs, universities, and opportunity are concentrated, the prices are even worse. For many, rent alone eats up over 30% of their income. In some cities, it's 40% or more. Add in health insurance, car insurance, food, and internet, and there's barely anything left. From 2012 to 2022, car insurance premiums more than doubled. Healthcare costs rose 46%, but wages, they only grew by 26% inflation adjusted. That's not a gap, that's a canyon, and it's not just housing or healthcare. College, the supposed key to financial security, is now a massive financial trap. In 1970, tuition at a private college averaged $1,600, around $12,000 today. In 2022, that same tuition costs over $41,000 public universities, a 4-fold increase over the same period. Even after inflation, a summer job used to cover a year of tuition. Now it can barely cover a textbook. The result? A generation buried in student debt before they even land their first job, and the jobs they're landing aren't what they were promised. Gen Z isn't lazy, they're exhausted. Over 53% of them work a full-time job and a side hustle, just to keep up with basic living costs. Some drive for Uber, others sell handmade goods online, and many are part of platforms they'd rather not admit to, because when rent is due, morals often lose to math. Nearly 60% of Gen Z adults say they feel constant stress about their finances, and that's not just anxiety, it's reality. In 2023, 1 in 7 had maxed out their credit cards, not from luxury spending, but from surviving, groceries, bills, emergencies, and even as they work more than ever, their paychecks fall behind. Many Gen Z employees are earning less than previous generations did at the same age, even in inflation-adjusted terms. In fact, they pay 31% more for housing than millennials did just a decade earlier, and compared to baby boomers, Gen Z has half the purchasing power. Imagine walking into your parents' first home at age 25 and removing 17 out of every 20 things they owned. That's what Gen Z can afford today, by comparison. Meanwhile, their debts keep growing, and not just from student loans. Credit card interest rates hit a record 21.76% in 2024. That's nearly double what millennials faced a decade earlier. It means even small balances spiral out of control fast. And what about job security? It barely exists. Getting a job used to mean stability, not anymore. Today, many Gen Z workers are disposable. Not because they lack talent, but because the system is built to treat them as temporary. The traditional full-time job with benefits? It's becoming rare. Instead, 36% of American workers are now part of the gig economy, delivering food, driving passengers, freelancing on platforms with no benefits, no security, and no clear path forward. This new economy is growing 3 times faster than regular employment. And it's where Gen Z finds itself trapped. Even in professional roles, layoffs are frequent. In tech, once the golden ticket, mass firings are now the norm. Spencer Kammerman, a Gen Z graduate in computer science, knows it too well. By age 25, he had been hired and laid off twice. He spent 8 months applying to hundreds of jobs, getting ghosted or beaten by AI-filtered systems. And when companies do have an opening, many don't want Gen Z. In a recent survey, 45% of employers said they'd rather hire retirees or freelancers than young adults. 37% said they'd rather use AI. 30% preferred to leave the position empty. The message is clear. Youth is no longer an asset. It's a liability. And when the few who do get hired face burnout, high expectations and low pay, it's no surprise that some are choosing to walk away entirely. Not from the job, from the dream. For decades, college was the golden ticket. Study hard, earn a degree, land a stable job. That was the promise. But for Gen Z, that promise feels broken. More than 36% of Gen Z adults aged 20 to 25 carry student loan debt, and the average balance is nearly $21,000. That's 14% more than what millennials owed at the same age. But the cost of college didn't just rise, it exploded. Since the 1970s, tuition at private universities has increased by over 2,100%. Even public universities, once considered affordable, have seen costs jump 2,580% after adjusting for inflation. In 1970, a summer job could cover a full year at a public college. Today, that might not even buy the textbooks. And while degrees are more expensive than ever, they're also more necessary. In 1973, only 28% of jobs required any higher education. By 2018, that number hit 63%. By 2031, it's expected to reach 72%, with nearly half requiring a bachelor's degree or more. So when older generations say, just skip college, they miss the point. For Gen Z, skipping college means skipping the job market entirely. But going to college often means entering adulthood already in debt, with no guarantee of a return. Even worse, recent graduates face an unemployment rate of 5.3%, higher than those without a degree, because in a volatile job market, inexperience trumps education. And for a generation already drowning in bills, that's a cruel reality. Then came the pandemic. Just as Gen Z was entering college or starting their first jobs, the world shut down. Offices closed, campuses emptied, internships vanished, and some of the most critical years for learning, networking, and building experience were lost behind screens. Instead of building careers, many built anxiety, and when the economy reopened, the damage was already done. They had fewer connections, less experience, and more debt. They were told to compete in a job market that barely had space for them, and when things got tough, many had nowhere to fall back on. Over 52% of young adults moved in with their parents during the pandemic, a number higher than even during the Great Depression. Not because they were lazy, but because there was simply no other option. Even now, 56% of Gen Z says they live paycheck to paycheck, and 60% don't have enough savings to cover just 3 months of expenses. One missed paycheck One medical bill, one job loss, and everything unravels. Older generations could rely on family support, home equity, or a slower-paced economy. But Gen Z, many of them grew up in households that were already struggling. There's no inheritance, no emergency fund, just the pressure to survive and to do it alone. Worse, they entered adulthood during a time of rising inequality. While a small group of wealthy young Americans inherited millions, most Gen Zers started at zero or below. And in a country where social mobility is declining, starting poor often means staying poor. They were told to dream big, to go to school, get a degree, find a passion, build a future. But that future, for many, never showed up. Instead, they found themselves overeducated, underemployed, and emotionally drained. Their diplomas didn't open doors. Their jobs didn't pay enough, and their lives became a constant balancing act between debt, burnout, and doubt. Some started to give up, not out of weakness, but exhaustion. They weren't quitting on success. They were questioning whether it still existed. For 23-year-old Sophie, the feeling wasn't panic, it was numbness. "Will we even get to retire?" she asked. "I'm not worried. I just feel powerless." And behind that feeling is a deeper truth. Gen Z watched the world change fast. They saw a pandemic freeze time. They saw housing prices double while wages stood still. They saw AI rise, automation threaten millions of jobs, and recruiters ignore them altogether. A report by McKinsey estimates that by 2030, 375 million jobs may be displaced by automation and AI. And while some doubt those numbers, one thing is clear. This generation is facing a future unlike any other. Future where traditional jobs vanish, where experience doesn't guarantee opportunity, and where even hard work can lead nowhere. Gen Z didn't fall behind because they made bad choices. They fell behind because the rules changed, and no one told them. The cost of housing doubled, college became a debt trap, jobs became unstable, and yet the advice stayed the same. Work hard, be patient, it'll pay off. But for millions of young Americans, it hasn't. They studied more, earned less, and watched the dreams slip further away. We often measure generations by what they build, but maybe we should also ask, what did they inherit? And what was taken from them before they even began? Because when an entire generation works harder and ends up poorer, that's not a failure of effort, that's a failure of the system. And just like every collapsing structure, it never breaks. All at once, it cracks, slowly, silently, until the day it falls. If this story helped you see things more clearly, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications for more stories that reveal how money really works. Thanks for watching.